Welcome, all of you. I appreciate that you were able to come and brave all of the storm conditions. I appreciate your coming to this unusual location. I want to thank the New School University for being so kind as to provide this facility for us on short notice. We hope, but as you have heard, I'm sure, we don't know for sure whether our December meeting will in fact be at the Brecht Forum or whether we'll have to find another location. So a good way to get into this evening's discussion might be to say a few words about the economics, since this is an economic update, of the storm, at least some of the dimensions. This was, as our mayor and governor must have repeated 5,000 times, a very bad storm. The only thing that got as much attention as the repetition about how bad a storm it was the way the two politicians fell all over themselves celebrating the heroic first responders, the firefighters and police personnel and many others who did indeed do lots of hard work and no doubt were heroes on many occasions. But that wasn't why they were getting the praise. They were getting the praise because it became desperately urgent for both of those politicians to distract attention from what they had failed to do, which is to anticipate and prepare for this crisis. The failure in that area is cataclysmic. I mean, we still have thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands, since the statistics here are wild and unreliable, that many people who are either without heat or power or hot water or telephone or internet or electricity of any kind. And here we are weeks after the storm passed. There were no fleets of trucks with alternative generators who might have gone into certain areas and provided power when they should have. They weren't ready. They weren't prepared. They had no plan, apparently, for how to operate the arteries in and out of the city. No plan to make certain avenues one-directional only for emergency vehicles so that they could get in and out of the city. The buses might have been able to move people since they weren't affected by the electric problems and the water problem. None of that was done. One really has to stop and think that for at least 12 years we have had Homeland Security with hundreds of billions of dollars expended, your money, to prepare us for something that would look something like what happened. And if that's what hundreds of billions of dollars gets, oh, are we in trouble? Much worse trouble than anything that happened over the last few days, because we're not prepared at all. At one point, after several days of no electricity in the lower part of Manhattan, below 34th Street, the Google Corporation, and I don't mind mentioning them here, was able, it has no responsibilities in an emergency, but it was able to get its trucks into lower Manhattan so that people in areas with no power could go plug in their cell phones and their other devices to get some power. Why the city had no trucks ever to do something functional like that is a mystery that only Mr. Bloomberg and Mr. Cuomo can know. So it was very important for them never to talk about the question of preparation. Keep that right off the agenda and talk only about the heroism of some of the responders and what a terrible storm this was. The point and purpose of anticipating and preparing and planning is to cope with this. They didn't do that. And now the economics. The current estimate of the amount of damage done in New York is in the range of $18 to $19 billion with a B. The current estimate for the whole region that was affected, $60 billion. In comparison to that, the cost of having had fleets of trucks in various locations that could have responded with food, with water, with electric generators, and a variety of other things, at least to those areas worst hit, is trivial. What it would have cost to get an organized system of people who are near the bus depots, school buses and regular buses, who live close enough to walk to that area and then be able to drive a bus to help out, is trivial. The cost of developing teams that could have gone into the public housing, those 18 and 20 and 30-story buildings where people couldn't get up and down because the elevators weren't working, and they're often older folks and they're sick folks. It's unspeakable. Nothing. The only nice part of what happened here isn't really so much the heroism of individual firefighters, police people, and so on, which was no doubt there. But it was an interesting opportunity for the Occupy Wall Street movement to redefine an area of activity. They were the leading volunteers in a number of locations, and still are. Staten Island, Breezy Point, and other parts of the city, where they mobilized volunteers from the political movement more effectively than the city, the state, or the Red Cross. It's an extraordinary display of what is possible when people are mobilized to do something and can make an adjustment and find themselves better equipped to solve problems than the people who are paid a fortune of money to do that. So much for the storm. Several little things before we get into the big one. One of the big ones is, of course, the economics of the election, which I'm sure many of you are interested in, so we're going to deal with that. But first, tomorrow is an important day in Europe. Tomorrow, the 14th of November. The European Trade Union Confederation, that is an international equivalent of the AFL-CIO in Europe, has organized a day of action and solidarity in every single country of Europe tomorrow, starting at noon. There will be strikes, general strikes, demonstrations, and activities of all sorts. Every major European capital, Rome, Paris, London, Berlin, everyone. There will be hundreds of thousands of people marching, and I thought you might be interested to know what it is. It's about opposition to austerity. That is, opposition to all of the programs from Greece to Norway, from Ireland to Poland, opposition to raising taxes on the mass of people or laying off public employees or cutting back public services. Those are the issues to which all of these people are opposed. And I urge you to think about it and to pay attention to the news sources tomorrow as the news of the events come in. If the media you look at cover this, it'll be front page news in every European country. There's no question of it. It already is, and it will be tomorrow. Just think to yourself about austerity imposed in Europe and this reaction versus what I'm going to explain to you in a few minutes, austerity imposed in the United States, ... Second, something remarkable happened and I'm in this election that I'm not going to be talking about in general because we're going to deal with the economics of it. So I thought I would mention it to you, excuse me, here at the beginning. And this, in a remarkable event, took place in the 43rd district election in the state of Washington in the Northwest for the House of Representatives in the state of Washington. And a candidate presented herself. Her name is Kshama Sawant. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. She is a dark-skinned person. She is, and you can see why I picked up on it, a professor of economics at a unit, I believe, of the University of Seattle, which is where this is near. And she decided to run for office. Only the unusual thing is she ran for office as a socialist publicly and said that the problem of our time is capitalism. And she appealed to the voters, and here are some of the things she said. I thought you'd be interested. While the Democratic, I'm quoting, while the Democratic Party pays lip service to working people, in reality, both the Democrats and Republicans are bought and owned by the richest 1%. It is high time that we, the 99%, have our own political representation. And another part of her statement, She associates herself with the Occupy movement, of which she was an active part. The vital need to break from the two parties of big business and build a mass workers' party, drawing together ordinary people, youth, and activists from Occupy, civil rights, environmental, and anti-war campaigns to provide a fighting alternative to corporate political parties. Capitalism has clearly failed the 99%. And the interests of workers and young people cannot be served within the framework of this decaying system. You know, to run for office in the United States talking like that might get you the predictable point something, something percent. She got 28% of the vote in her district. 28% of the vote. That's more than a quarter of the people in the 43rd District of Washington State voted for her. And she's run before, I believe, if I know her history, and this is a much better showing than the first time, so her curve is on the way up. And I thought it'd be interesting for all of us to understand that a crisis of this sort, not unusually, begins to polarize politics, and that the signs of that are not only in Greece and in other parts of the world, but are beginning to show up here as well. Okay. Let me turn then to the major topics for tonight. And given that we're a week after the national election, I'm going to talk a little bit about the economics, both of what the election was about, what the election was not about, and what now appears to be the number one issue with the election over. And that has to do with this peculiarly titled event called the fiscal cliff, which I know for some of you is a mystery just right there before we even get into it, but I'll explain all that. Like most things in economics, it's much simpler than it appears, even if listening to a lot of commentators might not show you that. Okay, first about the election itself. I assume I don't have to tell you the outcome because you know that. I wanted to say some things about issues that were not raised, because it's a way of showing everyone what these two parties aren't. They aren't about debating many of the issues. They are about making sure that many of the issues never get raised and never get debated. Or in the words, a famous philosopher, French philosopher, once said that the silences here are much more important than what you hear, or the silences are louder than the things being said. And in the case of the election, I want to just give you a sample. I could spend a whole night doing this. I'm just going to give you a sample of 3 or 4 major economic issues that were before the electorate, before the American people, about which neither candidate had one word to say. And some of these I've mentioned to you before, some I haven't, but I want to get them together here because it's so stark that nothing was said. So the first and the easiest is a federal jobs program. You know, the United States, the last time we were in a crisis like this in the 1930s, the Great Depression, the President of the United States went on the radio, as I've told you, and said to the American people, if the private sector either cannot or will not provide work for millions of Americans who want to work, then there's no alternative but for the federal government, me as president, he said, to do that. And between 1934 and 1941, Roosevelt created, and the estimates here vary. No one says it was less than 12.5 million jobs. Some people say it was as many as 19 or 20 million jobs. But the point is, we overcame the depths of unemployment by having the federal government go into the business of hiring people and paying them a decent salary. They did all kinds of conservation projects. You know, that's before there was environmentalism. But they knew that there were problems, rivers needed to be moved, and wetlands had to be preserved, and that's very labor intensive. The workers then built all kinds of bridges and other transportation facilities. They built several of the major Western national parks that Americans have enjoyed visiting for decades since that time. Very important, useful work was found for these millions of people who had an income, didn't feel bad about themselves as unemployed, were able to make their mortgage payments and hold on to their houses, and all the other consequences. The point only is that at the end of a period of 5 years, that's when we're now at the end of the 5th year of this crisis, when our unemployment is still in the millions and millions of people, to have a presidential race in which neither candidate remembers, this is a case of political amnesia, big time. Neither one of them remembers that that's another way to go. Neither one either advocates it or criticizes it. It's a much better arrangement. It's as if it never happened. So nobody has to take a position, nobody has to debate it or argue it or defend it. We just make it vanish. Amazing. Number 2, how do you deal with the deficit? The deficit being the difference between what the government spends and what it takes in taxes. That's all the deficit ever was. And people claim to be upset about that. We're going to have a lot to say about it tonight, but both candidates are very concerned. We know that because they said so. They're concerned about the deficit. Okay. Here's a way to reduce the deficit. Raise the taxes on the people who have enjoyed the greatest cut in taxes over the last 30 years. Who are they? They are the richest Americans, those in the top, who in the 1970s had a tax rate of 71% and today have a tax rate of 35%. Nobody else has enjoyed a tax cut on those dimensions. In the 1960s, these same people had a tax rate of 91%. They have really come down. So one way to solve the deficit would simply be to bring the tax rate back up to where it was. No big change, no radical new idea, no departure from history. No, just take them back. And who would they then fall on? The richest, those most able to pay more, those who've done the best over the last 30 years, and those whom we know, based on their deep and abiding patriotism, would want to do that. They would want to do that because it would be helpful to the nation at a time of its need. By the way, I didn't make up that argument. That was Roosevelt's argument. When he was asked, why are you taxing these people so high? His answer was very dramatic. He did it in the middle of the 1940s, in the middle of the war. He said, how can I be the president and send young men to war for $600 a year, which was what they were being paid, and allow people here at home who aren't even doing that to become billionaires? We can't do that. So he proposed to tax the rich very highly. Still leave them rich, but tax them in a big way to do their share when the mass of people were literally giving their lives. And so he argued that patriotism and the need to fairly distribute the burden of a national crisis meant that he could and he should tax the rich, which he proposed and which the Congress endorsed, including the Republican Party, because it was impossible at that time to argue with such a case. How were they going to do it? Anyway, was there a discussion of raising the taxes on rich people to anything like what they had been in the 60s and 70s? Not a word. As you'll see later when we talk about what's about to happen with this fiscal cliff, you'll see what the rates were that they were talking about. They were puny, they were small, the differences are tiny. No one talked about taking it back to where it was the last time we had a crisis like this. I don't want to take too much time, but the same applies not to taxing rich people, but to taxing business. Business taxes have been drastically reduced since the 1930s and 40s as well. So the same argument could be made there. Not only was there no argument, but both presidential candidates expressed themselves as in favor of reducing the corporate tax rate. They only disagree on how much to reduce it by, but they're both in favor of reducing it. And no debate about that either. Third, and perhaps the most dramatic And I keep explaining this, but there's something in the American mind that resists what I'm about to explain. I never quite understood it. We tax in the United States income. You know that. The federal income tax, the state income tax, and here in New York, we even have a city income tax, all three. So we tax income. And we also tax expenditures. We tax you when you earn the money. So all you have left is the money after taxes. And then when you go outside and you buy an ice cream, you pay some more tax when you make an expenditure. Keep that, by the way, in mind. All Americans are double taxed. There's nothing unique about business. Business people like to get up and explain, well, we shouldn't be double taxed. Yes, you should, because everybody else is. There's nothing unique about this. You are all double taxed. You're actually quintuple taxed, but just so you understand the double. So you pay a tax on the income, and then you take whatever money you have left after you've paid your income tax, and you pay more tax when you buy things, an expenditure tax. Sales tax is an expenditure tax, excise tax, special tax on alcohol, the special tax on motor fuels, and so on. All right, so what's the point here? There's something we don't tax. Oh, well, let's be careful. It's property. It's property. We tax the income you earn. We tax the expenditures you make. But do we tax your property? Well, the answer is the federal government doesn't. And state governments don't. But city governments do. All of you, directly or indirectly, if you live in New York, you pay a property tax to the city of New York. It's the major source of income, as it is for most cities and towns across America. So there is a tax on property. But now, bear with me. It's really only a tax on some kinds of property. And here comes the big one. You do have to pay tax on land. That's a kind of property. So if you own land in a town, you pay a tax on the value of the land that you own. If you own a home, you pay tax on the home. If you own other kinds of buildings, you pay tax on them. And in many cities and towns, you also pay tax on a car, on a boat, and other things. But there's one kind of property that is never taxed in the United States. Not by the federal government, not by the state government, and not by the local government. Property in the form of stocks and bonds. Let me do that again. The one kind of property, basically in this country, that you can own that will allow you to escape having to pay any tax on it is stocks and bonds. So let me make it stark. If you own a home for $200,000 in Yipsy Doodle, Alabama, I don't know if there's a place like that, but there might be. So suppose you have a home for $200,000 in Yipsy Doodle, Alabama. You pay a property tax to the town of Yipsy Doodle, like everybody else. If you sell that house and you use the $200,000 to buy shares of stocks and bonds, you pay no tax, neither to Yipsy Doodle, nor to the state of Alabama, nor to the United States government. Who owns the bulk of the stocks and bonds, would you guess, in the United States? 1% of the people own 75% of the stocks and bonds. That 1% has a form of property that is not taxed in the United States. So, if you want to raise money for the government, if we're in a time where we're running deficits we would rather not run, one of the obvious places you might look is to the ownership of stocks and bonds. You might suggest to them that if the kinds of property most Americans have, cars, homes, are being taxed, then gee, you might extend the property tax to include the other kinds of property. Wow, that would raise a lot of money. And who would it affect most? The 1% who owe the 75% of shares of stocks and bonds. Did the presidential debate cover this topic? Never. Not once. Not even that much. It's as if that issue wasn't there. And by the way, that is an issue that comes up in the business schools and economic schools of the United States that discuss property taxes. There are learned articles in law reviews, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that I'm not a special person who knows about something that other people don't know about. Anyone interested in this topic knows about it. The advisors to Mr. Obama and the advisors to Mr. Romney know all about this. So the decision not to talk about it gives you some idea. I could go on, but these are just a sample of the real issues that confront the American people, the real options that are out there for solving problems that are so upsetting to the people who run the society that they can't be discussed. That the way to handle them is to pretend that they're not there and hope that nobody says anything about it, which is why I do. Okay. Let's turn then to what the election demonstrated. And I'm not going to talk about all the things that are in the newspapers and that you're reading anyway. I want to focus a little bit on the economics. The difference between the two of them, the two candidates in economics, is really relatively small. They both agree that the deficit is a big problem. And again, I'm just going by what they say. They both agree that the deficit is a problem. They both agree that in order to bring the deficit down, the government is going to have to raise some taxes and cut some spending, because that's how you handle if you're spending more than you're earning. You earn more or you spend less, or a combination of both of them, and that's what they both candidates agree. They only disagree on the particular composition, which taxes are going to go up and how much and which spending is going to go down. But they're all in favor of reducing the deficit by rate. Now, it's very important you stay with me on this, because this is about the fiscal cliff too. They all agreed that the taxes have to go up on somebody to some amount, and the spending has to go down. Now, this is going to affect everybody in this room, because the taxes that are being discussed by both of them are taxes you all pay or don't. And those taxes are going to go up in all likelihood starting January 1 coming 2013 compared to what you're paying now. So unless your salary goes up, your take-home pay is going to go down. How much, we don't know yet, but it will. Likewise, the government is going to be spending less. Well, you don't need a PhD in economics. You don't even need a BA in economics. You don't need any economics at all to understand what I'm about to say. If the government takes more money away from you in taxes, then that's going to be less that you're going to be spending. So the impact on the economy there isn't particularly positive. And if the government, when it takes in more money, is at the same, by taxing you more, is at the same time spending less, that's another negative for the economy. The government isn't hiring people as much. The government isn't buying goods and services as much. And the people aren't either, because they're having to pay higher taxes. So when the government does whatever they're going to do as of January 1, which we're going to talk about in a minute, the effect on the economy is going to be, and everyone agrees, negative. Negative. We're in an economy that isn't in such hot shape to begin with. We have officially a 7.9% unemployment rate. That rounds out pretty good to 8%. And that works out to 13, 14 million people. So we're not in an economy that's roaring ahead. We're an economy that's limping along. And I just told you that both candidates are agreed on doing variations of something that's going to be a negative impact on the economic activity here in the United States. They just disagree over the specifics of all of that. So the end result of the election, in a sense, we knew beforehand. The people of the United States made something of a choice, as best one can figure it out. And they must have decided, as best I can tell, that while they're not happy with what Obama has done, they're not happy with where the economy is, given what it has done to them, and the prospects of there being no change of a significant nature anytime soon. And they must have looked at Mr. Romney and decided that that's even scarier. Not that what Obama is doing is all that attractive, but what Mr. Romney suggests, or at least what some of his people around him suggested, or what he sometimes suggested until he changed, is scary. And that may have made a difference, particularly in certain industrial states like Ohio and so on that were important states where the unions worked very hard to frighten their members about what Romney represented, but he did a good job of it anyway, so it wouldn't have mattered too much. So I don't think there was a very big surprise. Economically speaking, we got the lesser of the two negatives for the economy, and or as we used to call it, the lesser evil of the two. We'll see just how bad it gets in terms of what's coming next. Okay, let me turn then to what has quickly become the number one economic issue that we're going to face as a nation, and that is going to be a big item of debate and in the news at least for the next 6 to 7 weeks, probably longer, but at least for the rest of this year. And that is this so-called fiscal cliff. But first, let's be sure we all know what the condition of our economy is, and then I'll explain what the cliff is and what it portends for us. So you have been hearing again, as you did in the spring and summer of this year, noise about an economic recovery. For example, the last several months, there have been 150 or higher thousands of people added to the workforce, getting jobs. And that certainly is better than what it was in 2009 and 10 and so on. But it is way short of basically doing away with unemployment. We have to have much higher numbers of new jobs just to handle the people coming into the labor force, young people arriving each month at that age when they're looking for work. So we're not making a dent in unemployment because the increase in our employment, while it's better than a decrease, no doubt, is not big enough. But that's not all. The single most important statistic, I would argue, about the American economy, both in terms of where it's been the last 2 years and where it's going, is the following. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, which I constantly quote here because it's the best source of these kinds of statistics in Washington, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported 3 or 4 weeks ago, since our last monthly update, that the real wages, the real weekly wage of the American worker, the average American worker, fell 2.5% between October 2010 and October 2012. What does that mean? It's a simple calculation. Wages went up, but the prices people had to pay went up more. So the actual wage, what the wage allows you to buy, what you can afford with your weekly wage, dropped. How much did it drop? 2.4%. Well, that's the equivalent, lest you think, well, it's a little number, careful. 2.4% means that compared to October 2010, if you worked in 2010 and you worked right through till October 2012, a drop of 2.4% means that in 2012, you worked one entire week plus 1 day, 6 days, for which you did not get paid. That's what it means. A drop of 2.4% is 1 week plus 1 day of no pay at all. That's a significant cut in your income. So unemployment wasn't overcome, except a little. But that's completely wiped out by the fact that all working people, on average, lost income, were able to buy fewer goods and services. It was the equivalent of everyone in America being told that the last 5-6 working days of the year, you have to work for free. Why is that important? Because it means that the economy can't go anywhere. It's very dangerous for the housing market because that's money that the family needed to pay its mortgage and will not be there for that. And true enough, towards the end of this year, Americans, still way over indebted than they can afford to be, started resuming debt, started adding. They had been shedding debt. They've been adding debt. The single most important debt that has gone crazy over the last year has been auto debt, people borrowing money to get a car. So we have an economy which is unable to provide rising wages, which is what's necessary to get us out of this mess, pushing people to return to borrowing, which they cannot afford. And that's where we were when this horrible story started back in 2005, 2006. So we're not out of the woods, and we have some very bad signs coming down the road as where we're going. And by the way, the economics of this is very old and very well understood. If you have 12.5 million people unemployed, and another 10 million people not in the labor force but thinking of coming back because their families need it, or with part-time work who need and want full-time work, then you've created a situation where every employer knows that he or she doesn't have to raise wages because there's an army of people who are desperate for a job under almost any circumstances. And when you add to that the current length of unemployment, the average number of weeks a person is unemployed, is higher than it's been in half a century. 41 weeks now. Average person unemployed is out for, that's almost a year. That means you eat up your savings. It means you eat up the savings of the people near and dear to you who help you. And then what? Then you have to work because you've got nothing left to fall back on. And that's not a situation in which wages go up. That's a situation in which wages go down. And now we have the statistics to indicate that that's exactly what they've been doing. Okay. So now we come to this big issue, the so-called fiscal cliff. So let me explain first what it is and then what's at stake in it. Okay. Back about a year ago, in the autumn of 2011, the Obama administration and the Republican majority in the House of Representatives could not reach an agreement on what to do about this problem that they both think is there, called deficits. They couldn't. They tried to, but they couldn't. They called each other every name in the book. You may remember the Republicans threatened not to allow the debt ceiling to go up, allowing the government to borrow more money, which it has to do to run the society. You may not remember it because you may not have paid attention at the time, but there were dire headlines that if the Republicans refused, then the president could not write the checks to pay public employees of the federal government. There were stories in the newspaper. He would send an email to all the soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq saying they weren't going to get paid anymore, but they should quickly go out and do the same work anyway, et cetera, and all of that. It got so horrendous that they did a very peculiar thing. They agreed to pass a bill which said, here it comes now, that we can't agree. And so here's what we're going to do. We're going to give ourselves a year or so to try to agree. In fact, we're going to go right up to the 31st of December of 2012, this year. And here's what we're going to do. If we don't agree on a way to deal with our financial troubles, the deficit and the debt ceiling and all of that, if we don't agree by the 31st of December 2012, then an automatic set of tax increases and spending cuts will happen. So instead of our voting to do it, we're voting that if we don't do something else, that's what's going to happen. That's the law we're working with right now. That's the law. So that if Obama and the Congress now do not come up with an agreed law that they all sign and pass, or at least a majority has to vote for it to pass it, if they don't do that within the next 6 weeks, then these automatic things happen on the 1st of January 2013. What are the automatic things? Well, I'm going to go through them with you, and when I do now, and you see what the impact is on the American economy, if that happens, that's where the name going over a cliff comes from, because the impact is very bad, and it is like running off the end of a rock, like in all those cartoons, and you run your feet, and then after a few minutes, down you go, and you smash on whatever there is below. That's the idea. So first, so is that clear? Okay, good. So what is going to happen on the 1st of January coming if the Congress is unable. And over the last few days, you've heard about 50% political leaders saying, well, of course we'll come to an agreement. We can't have this fiscal cliff. And 50% of the time, the same people are saying, well, it's all your fault if we don't. And so it's quite clear now, if you pay attention to these things, I wouldn't advocate it, but in order to be able to talk to you, I do it. You discover that clearly what's happening with the two parties is each of them is calculating which is better for us, to reach an agreement and look like we're helping the American people, or to let there be no agreement and blame the other one for preventing it. And they're sitting there trying to figure that out. Of course, they will do what's best for the United States. They'll only put their own interests secondary, so there's nothing to worry about. But for some of you cynical folks, you might think otherwise. Okay. What's going to happen if no law is passed? Let's go through it. And the reason to go through it is if they make an agreement, it'll just be a variation of what I'm about to describe to you anyway, because that's what the issue is, and they all agree on what has to be done, basically. It's just the details. So here's what's going to happen. First, the tax cuts that come from the Bush era, George Bush, those expire on the 31st of December, and under the agreement, we will go back up to what they were when the George Bush administration lowered them and Congress went along. That means everybody's taxes, everyone in this room, will go up. More will be withheld from your check. If you're paid in the normal way with withholding for income tax, you will have more withheld. Number two, to give the economy a boost over the last couple years, the Obama administration reduced the amount of money taken out for Social Security from all of your checks significantly. That expires, too, on the 31st of December. So you will have withheld from your check more income tax and more Social Security. Your benefits won't change, but the money you'll have to give the government, and therefore the reduced take-home pay is what you're facing. At the same time, the government is going to do an across-the-board cutting of expenditure for everything. And we're talking $100 million, $125 million billion worth of spending cuts and several $100 billion worth of tax increases. The total package is variously estimated at between $500 and $700 billion. That was the rough size of the stimulus that we did a few years ago. So we're now doing whatever the opposite of a stimulus is. Or let's put it this way. This is not going to be a stimulus to make things better. This is going to be a stimulus to crunch. So it's going to hurt the economy significantly. And this is an economy that isn't healthy either. So what are the parties going to do? Well, depending on how they calculate what's good for them, they'll either come to an agreement or they won't. One of them or both of them. So we may look at the next 6 weeks seeing them blame each other for the failure to get an agreement. Or we'll see them clapping each other on the back, saying how wonderful we are, we got an agreement, and we saved America from going over a cliff, which those same politicians created in the first place. But they'll pretend that they're saving us from it and hope that we forget that they created it in the first place. So, what might happen before the 31st is an agreement. If an agreement is reached, then the cliff doesn't happen. But the problem is everybody already knows what this agreement will consist of. A variation on what was going to happen anyway. They will maybe not raise this tax. For example, Obama, during the election, and he's already done it again since he won re-election, has said he doesn't want the taxes to go up on the middle and lower income people, go back to the Bush era, which is what's going to happen if we don't have an agreement. He doesn't want that. He doesn't want it to go back up, except for the richest people. People earning over $250,000 a year as an individual or $500 as a couple. So too many of you don't look to be worried here. I'm talking to the wrong audience, obviously, but in any case. So Obama is in favor of taxing the rich in the sense that he does want them to go back to what they had to pay before, even though the middle and the lower income won't have to. What will that mean for the rich? Let me tell you now, so you don't spend too much time crying for them. Their current rate is 35%. If it goes back to what it was, it'll be 39%. That's what we're talking about. 4% more. It will not affect wealthy people in any significant degree. So before you get all excited that at least President Obama wants to do something, the rich, what he wants to do is to whip them furiously with a feather. And he hopes you focus on the furiously and not on the feather. But it's a feather. And that's why wealthy people are not going to be terribly upset if that's what happens. And that's all he's asked for. He's not about to tax them more than that. And he's hopeful that therefore they won't get very angry, and he may be right. We will see. Okay, so that's the nodule of difference. Other than that, the Republicans are displeased. They want the deficit reduction to be accomplished more by government spending cuts rather than by taxes. So that will be another sticking point between the Democrats and the Republicans. Not that we have to cut the deficit, not that we don't have to raise taxes and cut spending, but the balance between them. Republicans want more spending cuts, Democrats want more tax increases. But they all recognize that the impact on the economy will be negative. Okay? So now let's analyze this. What, and I'm sure it must have occurred to many of you, what is going on here? Why are there all these politicians agreed that the deficit is such a terrible problem? My guess is, and I only say this after teaching this subject in several universities for 40 years, that most people do not lose a lot of sleep about the federal government's budget deficit. When they think about it at all, it has the same attractive power as an advertisement for soap. It's not part of your life. You don't give a flying you-know-what for it. And it's a little hard to understand what all these people are doing, acting like it matters a lot. Does it matter to you a whole hell of a lot? I could embarrass you by asking you to tell me, how big is the deficit this year? How does it compare with, I'm sure some of you know, but most of you don't. And I understand why. This has got nothing to do with you or me. So what is it? If it's got nothing to do with you or me, if it's not an important or interesting matter for most of us, why are they fixated on it? President, House of Representatives, Senate, all of that. All right, let's see. The United States owes, well, let's do it backwards. When the government spends more than it takes in taxes, it has to borrow the difference. Just like if you spend more than you earn on your job, you're going to have to borrow it from someplace. Your mother, your grandmother, the bank, somebody has to give you a loan. And the government's exactly the same way. So a deficit is simply the annual difference between what the government, federal government spends and what it takes in taxes. And that difference, it borrows. Okay? And so at the end of the year, it has borrowed a bunch of money, and that then is part of the national debt. And the total national debt is simply the addition, the sum of all the deficits that we've had in the past that we still as a government owe. That's all it is. National debt is the sum of the deficits. So, number one. Number two, what is the debt? Just so we have the numbers in our head. What is the deficit schedule for this year? A little over $1 trillion. That's a lot. Total output of goods and services in the United States this year will be in the neighborhood of 15 trillion. So the government's deficit is 1/15 of that. That's a lot. What's the total national debt? The accumulated debt of the United States, it's about 15 trillion. Our total debt is about the same as our total annual output of goods and services. Okay? Now we have a big debt. That's pretty high. There are plenty of countries in the world that are much lower than that, don't owe that much. But we owe a lot. By the way, that makes us the biggest debtor in the world. No other country comes close to $15 trillion worth of debt. So we are the #1 debtor country in the world. Nobody's close. And since I cannot resist provoking you, I want to remind you, as I often do, that side by side with one country in the world that is the greatest debtor, who is the country that is the greatest creditor, the country that lend to the United States? Who's the major lender to the United States? The People's Republic of China. So let me summarize. The world's #1 capitalist country is up to here in debt to the world's #1 communist country. There must be some meaning here that some of you might want to dwell upon, just to upset whatever your high school civics teacher might have told you, okay? So the United States borrows and has been borrowing a lot. The national debt shot up in the last 3 or 4 years. This is very important, really zoomed. Why? Because of the economic crisis. It's very obvious. It takes off when the crisis hits. It's not too swift to figure out the connection. And why is that? Very simple. When you have a crisis where unemployment zooms, millions of people who used to pay an income tax because they had a job with an income, they don't have a job, so they don't have an income, so they pay less in taxes. This is not complicated. And likewise, both the people who lose their jobs and the people who see their neighbors and friends and relatives losing jobs are a little easier about spending money than they used to be. So they don't spend as much, and therefore they don't pay as many sales taxes, do they? So wherever you turn, federal government, state government, local government, tax revenue of the city falls in an economic crisis. But by the same token, the demands of the people in a period of crisis of service from the government go up. They need unemployment insurance. The government has to pay. As the government takes in less, it has to pay out more. Welfare demands of people who have to go on welfare get worse in an economic crisis. During the campaign, you may have heard the Republicans, I think Mr. Gingrich was big on this, lambasting food stamp distribution in America. Millions of more people get, well, that's the government has to spend the money for food stamps. So the reason the government has to borrow like crazy is that an economic crisis reduces the revenue that comes into the government at the same time that it puts greater demands on spending. If the government has to spend more while it's earning less, its deficits balloon. And they did. Year after started in 2008, and it kept right on going. More than $1 trillion for several years. We've never had that before. So the debts of the United States went crazy. As they did, by the way, in many other countries. You read about Greece. That's what happened to Greece. You read Italy or Spain or Portugal or Ireland or many other countries. It's all the same story. The same crisis. Their revenues go down. Their outlays go up. And remember, Europe is a social democratic societies, those countries. They have much more generous social programs. For example, they have a national health. Health costs are paid by the government. Everybody gets that health coverage as a matter of your citizenship. Has nothing to do with whether you're working or not. That money has to get paid out, et cetera, et cetera. The government has a lot of expenses. Okay, so now you understand why the deficit goes up. But that's not answering the question, who cares? Or why should we care? That has to be answered. So it goes up. Well, who's worried about it when the deficit goes up? Once again, look to your left, look to your right. You're not worried about it. You didn't lose 1 minute's sleep about this. You probably didn't even know, or if you knew, you didn't care much about it because it was not interesting. But somebody cares. Well, you can figure out who might care. The people who might care are the lenders. For the same reason that lenders always worry when the borrowers are suddenly borrowing a ton of money. It begins to cross the mind of the lender, uh-oh, they are borrowing so much that they may not be able to repay. If you've never had that nice experience, go to the bank, particularly when things are not so good in your life, and ask them for a loan. And watch the face of the person you're talking to as it gets depressed or sad or nasty, depending on the personality. They're not going to give you the loan. You kind of figure that out after the first 4 minutes. But they're going to dangle you there for half an hour being polite to you while telling you no. And why no? Because looking at your employment record and looking at your income and looking at you, no, they're not going to do that because it's too risky. Can a government have that happen to it? Of course it can. Governments around the world from time to time borrow more then they can pay back. The last big country to do that, and a lot of countries do it, the last big one to do it about 10 years ago, a little more, was Argentina. Big, most important economy in Latin America other than the Mexicans. Huge economy, very wealthy. Argentina defaulted, that's what we call it. It defaulted. It told all the folks around the world who had lent them money, billions and billions of dollars, have a nice day, you're not getting it. And then there was yelling and screaming and just like you hear in Europe now. And then finally a deal was worked out. And the Argentinians agreed to pay the creditors 40 cents back for every dollar that they had borrowed. And the creditors took it because the alternative was to get nothing at all. So they took it. So does this happen from time to time? Yes. All creditors of governments know that periodically governments can't pay. And by the way, it isn't a matter of the political leader. He or she might be willing to pay. It's the masses who are beginning to say in a country that is in trouble, and pay attention here because that's what's coming here. It may be that the government is ready to pay back, but where is the government in a country that is having trouble? Where's it going to get the money to pay back the creditors? Well, here we go now. It's going to have to either raise taxes on its people to get that money to pay off its creditors, or it's going to have to lay off workers and cut programs and use the money that they can save by cutting all these programs and give it instead to the creditors. But now the people become involved because they're watching, this is happening right now in Greece, big time. They're watching that the school is going to close, and instead of 20 kids in a class, it's going to be 83, and they're not going to get the pension that was promised to them because that's how the government is going to save the money which it needs to pay off its creditors. That means the Greek people are going to be told, we're about to screw you and your children in order to make big payments to German banks who are big lenders. You remember World War II? The Germans came out with a bad rep, and the Greeks didn't like them. And they like them less now because they see that it is a demand of the creditor that is literally costing them their standard of living and any hope for their children. The Greek young people are leaving Greece right now in record numbers. Hasn't happened for generations. Greeks are going all over to the United States, Western Europe, Britain, France, and so on. Well, let's get back here to the United States. So who's worried about the United States going into deficit are the creditors. Now, I have to inform you all of something you already know. You are not a creditor. None of you have had that experience, have you? You haven't sat down with an agent of the government to discuss how much you're going to lend to Uncle Sam. None of you have had that experience. And the reason you haven't had that experience is you're not rich. Who lends to the United States government? Banks, number one. Insurance companies, number two. You ever wonder what the insurance company does with the premiums you mail them all your life, hoping, like, crossing your fingers, that you never have to have a claim? Because you don't want to have a car accident, you want to have a house burned down. You want never to deal with a claim. What you want is just to send them money always until you die. And that's exactly the way they like it too. Okay? So you may have wondered to yourself, what does the insurance company do with all the money coming in by all the people who make no claims? Their job is to invest it. They make money with that money, and they hope to make so much money that even after they pay off the people who have a fire or have a car accident, they'll be left with rich profits for themselves. And one of the things they do with all the money sent in by the people who have an insurance policy is they lend it to the government. So banks, insurance companies, large corporations, and wealthy people. The only other entity that lends to the United States government are other governments. Number one, the People's Republic of China. So those are the people who are angry. It isn't the average American who could care less. It's the creditors of the United States who, and they do the same with other countries, look at this and they say, whoa, we could get a situation here in the United States where the president of either party announces, of course we will honor our debts, and at the same time announces to the people, pay attention folks, because this is going to happen in a few weeks. We were going to have to cut your programs and raise your taxes. And then there's going to be some folks, you know, sort of, I don't know, like me, who are going to draw the line. They're going to say, you know why you're getting cut? So we can pay off the banks. Let's do this again. We're going to pay off the banks. The banks. Where did the banks exactly get the money to lend to the government? If you understand this, you're going to get high finance. They got it from the government. The government bailed them out for the last 5 years. The government gave them trillions. Now you know what they did with the trillions. They didn't lend it to business. That's why we don't have full employment. They used it to lend it to the government. The government gave them the money or lent them the money, and they lent it back. What was the interest rate charged by the Federal Reserve to give banks lots of money? 0.5%. What does the United States government pay those banks when they lend that money back to the United States? 2 to 3%. You notice anything? They're getting money at a lower rate than they're being paid for that same money. That's why banks have large smiles. This crisis has helped them enormously. But the beautiful irony is the banks that brought us to this crisis, who got bailed out first and best during the crisis, are now waving their finger at the United States government and saying, you know, I'm worried about you. You're not going to pay me back the money you gave me to lend to you. And the American government is worried. Why? Why doesn't it just tell them to go jump in the lake? Why? Because the American government knows it needs them. The minute the creditors believe that there's the slightest risk that the American government either will not honor its debts or will be prevented by angry people who want their schools to be maintained, they don't care whether those creditors get the money. The masses depend on the government services. A tiny minority owns the debt of the government. This is easy. This is, once again, your 1% and your 99%. So the creditors are smart. They go to the government, they say, we want to see that we're safe here with our loans to you. We want to see that you're not going to jeopardize us. And until we see that, here's what we're going to do. We're going to jack up the interest rates. We're not going to lend to you at the low interest rates we used to because you're becoming more risky because you're borrowing so much. Oh, the politicians get frightened because if the interest rates go up, they have to pay more money out, which means they have to raise taxes or cut expenditures to get that money. That's scary for them. So they decide the best thing to do to keep this situation from blowing up on us is to demonstrate to the creditors that we mean business, you don't have to worry, we'll pay you back. And the only way that the creditor will believe it is if you start doing it. You got to start reducing your deficits so you're not borrowing so much. And how are you going to do that? You got to stick it to your people. You got to raise their taxes or cut expenditures for them or both. And so everywhere across the world, that's what's being done. Governments terrified by what the lenders to them will do, raise interest rates. By the way, if you want to see what happened, that's how Greece collapsed. The creditors of Greece said, we're not lending to you anymore the way we used to at 2, 3, and 4%. And the worst moment, 2.5 years ago, the Greek government was required to pay 28%. You're done at that point. You can't. The amount of money you have to siphon out of your people to pay off the creditors. And Greece has the greater problem that the bulk of its debt is held by French and German banks. So it's not just that the Greek people are being fleeced to create money for the lenders, but that the lenders are not even Greeks. Makes it a little worse for the Greeks. We will have that here too. Even now, I'm going to tell you something, which I've mentioned in these meetings before, but which also was never spoken in in the presidential election because both candidates realized what trouble they would be in with the American people if they made it clear. If the United States' number one creditor is the People's Republic of China, if they've lent us in excess of $1 trillion, which they have, and we pay them interest, which we must, and if that interest is in the neighborhood of 4%, which it is, that means that every year the people of the United States send to Washington $40 billion, which what Washington does is take the money we all pay in taxes on our cigarettes or our gallon of gas or our income tax or whatever. All that Washington does with $40 billion of that is say to all of us, thank you, put it in an envelope, and deliver it to Beijing to pay the interest on the debt. $40 billion. And the People's Republic of China, led by the Chinese Communist Party, says thank you and uses it to build up the Chinese People's Liberation Army. So on behalf of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, I want to say to all of the American people, thank you. Oh, thank you very much. Very nice that you send us $40 billion. Do all Americans want to be in the position of sending their tax dollars to the People's Republic of China? I don't think so. And so one of the ways we handle that in our political life is to make sure they don't know about it. And we don't say it. But it is the case. The Chinese are our creditors. We got to pay interest. And the Chinese are among those saying, you better not borrow too much more because we will be nervous and we will not lend you anymore. And then you will be in the soup because we're your major creditor. So one of the people putting pressure on the American government right now is the People's Republic of China because they're the number one creditor we have. Very serious. So there is a problem with the deficit. The problem is that our political leaders don't want to get themselves into difficulty by doing anything that would upset the creditors. That's why everybody who's a political leader simply says, that's of course a problem, and we have to deal with it. It's like, when it rains, you have to have an umbrella. If you don't care about an umbrella, then there's something wrong with you. And if you don't care about the deficit, there's something wrong with you, even though most Americans haven't the faintest idea what it is. But our politicians take it as a given item. When a government crunches down on its people to pay off its creditors, that's called in Europe austerity. You're imposing on your people rising taxes, and you're laying off public employees and cutting back government programs. That's called austerity. We don't call it that here, but we're doing exactly the same thing. It's austerity here, it's austerity there. Our political leaders will tell us it's prudent fiscal policy or things like that. That's like the practice over the last several years of talking about increasing the money supply, which the Federal Reserve has been doing, and calls it instead quantitative easing. What? Yes, quantitative easing. That has the same deep meaning as converting the title bus driver into transportation engineer. It makes the bus driver feel better, which is a perfectly good reason, but we don't even get a better feeling out of quantitative easing, although maybe we would. Maybe it's less scary than printing money. But it is the same thing. All right, now let's do the analysis. Do we have to reduce the deficit? Okay, do we have to? Well, there's a whole group of opinions in the United States, important opinions, that don't agree with that. They argue as follows. By the way, who are they? They're liberals, they're Keynesian economists, they're people, and again, I keep telling you, if you want to get this point of view, read the columns by Paul Krugman in the New York Times. He articulates this 2 to 3 times a week, okay? So here's the idea of these people. It is crazy. They're not nice, these people, they're nasty. It is crazy, they say, to do this. And their argument is very simple. you're going to try to deal with the deficit by raising taxes and cutting government spending, austerity. But that's lunacy, because that's going to hurt the economy. If the government is spending less, and if people have less to spend because they've had to pay more taxes, they're going to buy fewer things, and that's going to throw more people out of work, and that means less taxes coming into the government, so you're not going to improve the deficit of the government, you're actually going to make it worse. And then they point to Greece as an example, to Great Britain and Ireland as examples, and so on. So these people say, this is a crazy policy. You shouldn't do this. Well, what do they advocate? They say the opposite. Make the deficits bigger. What we need is to get out of the economy, Paul Krugman, out of the economic morass. The government should be cutting taxes so people have more to spend, and the government should be spending more money. In other words, run the deficit up. And what's the argument? By having the government spend more and by having taxes go down, we're going to give the economy finally the boost, the support to get us going again. And if we can get that and people get hired, those people, of course, will now be able to pay taxes and it'll solve itself. The deficit will go away because we've accomplished economic growth. That's their plan. Okay? That's what they want. They're putting pressure on Obama to go in that direction. He's not responded to that pressure in the last few years. I don't see him doing it in the future, but they're trying again. And if he believes he got a great mandate on things like that, maybe he would go a little bit in that direction. Or maybe if the American economy tanks down again in the next year, which there's plenty of indication it might, then it'll be forced on him. But that's one position, that the deficit doesn't matter so much as getting the economy going again, so forget about the deficit. Don't worry. And when people say, well, gee, the lender, won't they get angry at us? No, say these liberals, because the rest of the world is so terrified by the global capitalist crisis that rich people all over the world are moving their money to the United States. There's no difficulty for the American government to borrow like there's no tomorrow. Because after the people say, I'm nervous about your borrowing so much, the answer of a snarling Washington bureaucrat is, okay, don't lend the money to us. Keep it there in Thailand, which won't survive very long, will it? Or keep it there in Portugal and take your chances. In other words, the wealthy of the world are moving their money here because it is one of the safest places to keep your wealth. You all ought to understand that, because one of the places that wealth comes first is New York City. And the form it takes is buying property everywhere, buildings, apartments, co-ops, whatever. It's a way for them to store wealth away from their own country, away from the clutches of their own people if revolution should arise. It's a scandal in Greece, the amount of money that wealthy Greeks have taken out of that country in the last 2 or 3 years, making its economic problems that much worse. Well, here's another perspective, besides the conservative one that we have to impose austerity on the American people to deal with the creditors, and besides the liberal argument that we ought to just spend our way into a better situation. Here's a Marxist argument, a more radical argument. It begins as follows. This is not the choice we face. We are not choosing between either crunching our people with austerity to placate our lenders, and that the only option is forget about the lenders, let's just borrow our way and get the economy going again. That's an unnecessary either or, the Marxist argument goes. And their answer is as follows. We could allow the government to stimulate the economy the way the liberals want, but we don't have to have the deficit get worse to do it the way the conservatives worry. We don't have to. The way to do it is simple. The government should spend like crazy and pay for it, basically the way Roosevelt paid for a lot of what he did. Tax corporations and the rich. That way the government gets all the revenue it needs to stimulate the economy, but it doesn't have to borrow anything because it's raising it in taxes on the rich and on corporations. Now, why would that make some sense to do? Well, let's see. What are corporations doing with all the money that they're sitting on these days? Answer, not much. They're sitting on it. The estimates right now are that corporations have in cash holdings $2 trillion. Whoa. They're not investing it. They're not building factories. They're not hiring people. They're not doing it. And when you ask them, why aren't you? Because it's all public knowledge. They answer, the economy's in very bad shape. We're not going to invest money to produce more goods. We can hardly sell the stuff we're already producing. Wow. If the government taxed them, money that is sitting, not being spent and not helping anybody, would be transferred to the government, which would immediately spend it on everything, and that would be good for the economy, wouldn't it? It would. But the plot thickens. If the government doesn't tax them, then the government runs a deficit. And where does the government borrow the money if it runs a deficit? From the same people. Because they're the only ones who have it. When the government doesn't tax the rich and runs a deficit, it borrows from the rich. And of course, now you understand why rich people prefer the one to the other. Which would you rather do? Pay out money in taxes? Kiss it goodbye, it's gone? Or lend that money to the government, which not only pays it all back to you in a few years, but pays you interest every year while waiting. That's not a hard one. So the leftist answer is tax them. Tax them. One more time. Tax them. Well, they scream, if you tax us corporations and rich, well, we won't invest the money. And that will be bad for the economy. Well, the problem with that is, as I just explained to you, they're not doing that. And remember, when you cut taxes, it's something that drives me personally crazy when I listen to the radio and the TV. This endless argument, you cannot tax corporations and the rich, because then you will be stifling the job creator. What? When you cut taxes on a corporation or rich people, all you've done is told them you don't have to pay taxes the way you used to. That's what it means to cut taxes. They now get to keep money that before they had to give to the government. That's all it means. It's a completely open question what they do with the money. There is no law and no rule that obligates them to take the money that they don't have to pay in taxes anymore and use it to hire people with. They might do that if that was interesting to them. But then it's even an open question, do they hire Americans or do they hire Chinese people? Our businesses are busy hiring Chinese people and Indian people and so forth. But under a free enterprise system, the businesses and the rich people are free to take the money that they don't have to pay in taxes and do whatever the hell they want with it. They can hold on to it. They can stare at it for hours a day. They can put it in jars. They can use it to go on vacation in Spain. They can invest in other countries. There's a whole lot of things they can do and that they typically do other than creating jobs in the United States. So to make an equation, if you cut taxes on businesses and the rich, they will create jobs. That isn't true. And by the same token, if you tax them, you're not stifling job creation, nothing of the sort. On the contrary, if you tax the money from rich people and companies, and the government then uses it to spend, you're going to create a lot of demand for goods and services, which is going to lead those same rich people to hire folks, because they got new customers. That's what happened in the 1930s. Roosevelt did that. He did that because of the pressure from below. Remember, I've gone through that. The unions, the socialist and communist parties, strong in the United States in the 1930s, forced Mr. Roosevelt, as a good politician, to spend the money, to tax the rich. So it isn't even a very radical proposal. It's a proposal that looks a lot like what a previous Democratic president did in the United States. But what really does make it radical is this last step now. The problem with what Roosevelt did is, of course, that it couldn't last. It didn't last. That's why we're in the pickle we're in now. What did the business community do? Well, they were in a position to do something because all Roosevelt ever did was tax them. It solved the immediate problem. It put millions of people back to work. But it left corporations owned by their shareholders and run by the board of directors selected by the shareholders. And what did those companies do? As soon as the war was over, as soon as Mr. Roosevelt was dead, they went to work to undo all of that. And the first thing they did over the next 35 years, you all know, either from your history reading or from your experience. The business community was horrified by the taxes they were required to pay. They didn't appreciate that Roosevelt helped the situation because they had to pay for it. So they said to themselves, how are we going to undo this? And they knew it wasn't Mr. Roosevelt that was the problem. It was the labor movement and the socialists and the communists. So as soon as the war is over, what does the conservative and business part of this society go to work to do? Demonize the communists as evil traitors. Squash, destroy the Communist Party. Squash, destroy socialism and the Socialist Party, and kill off the labor movement as far as you can. For 50 years, the labor movement in this country has gotten weaker. They were right. They went after the three forces that made these things happen in the 1930s, which is why they're not happening now. We don't have the organizations that existed then to force it. So the solution is one of two things. You got to rebuild that organization. Maybe Occupy Wall Street is the first step. You got to rebuild the organizations. But you also have to learn the lesson. If all you do is rebuild the organizations, and all you do is tax the rich, but you leave them in control of the enterprises, they're going to do again, when that is over, what they've done the last time. And that's why you have to change the way enterprises are organized. That's why the workers have to take over the enterprises, because if they don't, they'll find themselves in the situation that we find ourselves in now. An almost surrealistic audience of Americans suffering austerity, watching the two parties plan worse austerity, disagreeing only on the details, and sitting here, as I hope many of you are, wondering, how much will I lose in taxes for my weekly check? Whether the cutbacks will affect me, my family, my community, my employer. We are suffering austerity, just like the Europeans who are going to go on a continent-wide demonstration tomorrow to fight it. This is coming to a head. This situation is not getting better. It's getting worse. That's why there's a continental-wide demonstration tomorrow, more powerful and bigger than anything Europe has seen for half a century. The whole system of capitalism is in a very serious crisis. And the more you hear experts who talk about what's going on and never mention the crisis of the economic system, the more you should see that as evidence that the crisis is here. Because that is how it's dealt with here. Just like the two candidates dealt with public employment as if it never happened, couldn't happen, never should be, is not a possibility, nothing worth discussing. That's a sign. That's a sign that this is terrifying for them and that they too, in some sense, know that it's nearby. It's just their reaction is to turn away and to pretend it isn't there. Okay. Let me look at my time constraint. Okay, 5 more minutes and I'll stop. Couple of side aspects of this that I want to make sure you have in your mind. And because of time limits, I'm only going to talk about one. The impact that all of this is having on cities and towns across the United States. Because it's going to come home to many people in that way. And I'm going to take as an example a city that has now declared bankruptcy, a big city. I believe it has between 200,000 and 300,000 people in it. So that's, by American standards, a big city. It's the city of San Bernardino in California, in the southern part of California, sort of an hour east of Los Angeles. It is in desperate shape. It is a city that has suffered terribly from the economic crisis. It is a city that has suffered from home foreclosures, a lot of empty homes in and around San Bernardino. And there's a tremendous fight to try to understand what has happened. San Bernardino is not getting enough revenue to survive as a city. I mean, survive in the sense of having police officers, fire officers, basic maintenance of the streets, schools, and everything else. The basic services that cities provide in our society, San Bernardino, and it's not alone, not by a long shot, but it's a prime example, and it's right at the cusp of it now. They can't function. Their revenue is so low that they cannot honor the pensions that they have provided to their public employees, school teachers, firefighters, police officers, and all the rest of it. They can't do that at the same time that they maintain the schools, they can't do it, and there's no prospect of them doing it. So they now have to decide what to do in this crisis situation. Nothing that happens on the 31st of December is going to help them. If anything, it's going to make it worse, but they're on their own. The state of California is in such difficulty, it can't help them. So they're on their own. And they're on their own in the most practical way. Will your child go to school or not? Will it be safe? They have a serious gang problem in San Bernardino, very serious. And they don't have the personnel and the police to cope with it, let alone social workers or any of the other kinds of professionals who might. So all these situations are becoming urgent, life and death sometimes matters for the people of the city of San Bernardino. So what are they going to do? Here's what they're now struggling with. The politicians, a lawyer, everybody who's involved. We can't pay all the people we need to pay. So they're deciding who not to pay. That's what they're doing. And that's what more and more American cities are doing, and more will be doing. So, for example, the big struggle in San Bernardino is this. Do we keep the basic services going that people living here need now? If we do, we have to tell the people who have pensions that they're not getting them. That's very tangible. That's a letter in the mail to Mrs. O'Leary, who spent her life as a school teacher in San Bernardino, teaching the 3rd grade in the Lincoln Elementary School, who lives off of the pension from the city, who is getting a letter saying, you used to get $1,284, you're going to get $483, which means she's out of her home. She can't. She cannot cover her rental. And in that event, she goes to the rent assistance office downtown and discovers that it isn't there anymore because they laid off the rent assistance staff because that was an earlier cutback before they actually, that's what's going on. The unions and these workers are screaming bloody murder, that they gave a lifetime of work to the city of San Bernardino, that can't have their pension, that they were promised a pension, that there's an obligation. They may succeed. They're going into courts, which means lots of lawyers have to get paid to fight all this. If the pensions win, that is, the city has to honor the pensions, then the cutbacks in city services will be very severe. That's what's going on. There are now roughly 200 cities in the United States that are now doing this, including many large ones. And the list of cities facing this problem gets bigger every day. So this is a delayed consequence of this crisis, which means that it'll be playing itself out in its impact on all of us, not only in the federal level that we read about in the newspaper, but in the state levels and in the local levels in this manner. It is a very serious problem. And the cities can't get help from the states because the states have this problem, and the states can't get help because the federal government has this problem. What's the conclusion here? Well, I don't want to beat the proverbial dead horse, but I enjoy it, so I will. This is a system that is not working. You don't need a whole lot of help, I hope, to understand that. And what do I mean it's the system? I mean something very specific. Everybody in the United States now, with very few exceptions, is playing by the conventional rules of the game. Not General Petraeus. But most of the others are doing that. Okay, they're playing by the rule. The bankers are doing what bankers do. They collect money, they make loans, they try to have the least risk to the loan and make the most return. And the businessmen are looking about what they should or shouldn't invest in order to do well by the companies that have hired them to be an executive. And workers are trying to provide a decent standard of living for their families and their children, the American dream, a college education. You know the routine. Everybody's doing what it is you're kind of supposed to do. And there's no point in looking, yeah, are there some crooks amongst us? Yep. And they're pretty much everywhere. Are there people gaming the system at the top? Yes. And are there people gaming the system at the bottom? Yes. And are there people gaming in the middle? Sure there are. It's not interesting. What's interesting about what's going on is that we have a system that so defines the rewards and the punishments for behavior that make us all pretty much play by the rules, most of us, and the end result is a disaster for everyone. Even the rich at the top are discovering this isn't working out real well. Wall Street wanted Romney. They didn't get it. They're not happy. They're not happy. The rich in Greece did not want things to work out this way. They're scared. They're running out of Greece as fast as they can. They like Greece. They'd like to stay there. This is ending up messing up everybody. That's when the system is the problem. Throwing a few bankers in the jail, what do you think the next group of bankers is going to do? The same rules apply to them, the same rewards and punishments, the same behavior will come. Therefore, you got to change this. You have to break out of the notion that the system is to be taken for granted as if it's necessary, like, night and day, one after the other. Capitalism was born as a system. It is evolved as a system. And like every other system before it, it passes away. The point is not to pretend to yourself that that can't happen. Why would you do that? What would make you think that? And if it's possible that it has run its time, then the sooner we face it and get to work on making something better to replace it, the better off we'll be, rather than sticking our head in the sand, so frightened of alternatives that we have to pretend to ourselves, despite all the evidence around us, crashing in on us, that this is a system that ought to be changed. And we have to remember that, last point, here in the United States, we have a serious problem having that conversation. We have to face that, particularly for our fellow citizens. We have now had half a century in which it was impossible to raise the fundamental question of capitalism as a system. This is a society that demonized that made it impossible. If you said something like that, you were considered either to be stupid or ignorant or uneducated or a traitor or a spy, or any one of those will shut up most people, but the combination shut up virtually everybody. And to drive the point home, we arrested a few people who kept talking like that or deported them. That's some years ago, but we did that. And so we shut it down. We became a nation that could debate the school system and change it, and debate the energy system and change it, and debate the housing system, but not the capitalism. Capitalism, all you do is stand up and repeat the high school football game cheer. It's wonderful, it's wonderful, it's wonderful. It is so wonderful, I like it more. That's it. And you all know what happens to a system if you don't subject it to criticism. It rots. you kind of invite it to indulge its worst tendencies because there's no criticism, there's no debate. Okay, we're stuck with that now. But we have to, as a first step, all of us, I think, do what I try to do also, which is to open this space up, to make it possible to talk about it, to use the word capitalism every chance I get, to put it on the table, to take away its mystical, dangerous, scary quality so it becomes part of the language. And that is happening. If you look around, you'll see that, it's possible. I always take my hat off, even though I know some of you don't like him, I always take my hat off to Michael Moore. When he made the decision to use the word capitalism in that last film of his, that was a major move. I know I worked on that film with him, so I know he thought about that a long time, and they had another title that they were thinking of. But he decided, he personally made the decision at the end to go with that, but they were scared. They were scared how that would be received. But I think you're seeing a sign that these talks I give, this recognition, the very evolution of what's happening in the United States is going to put the system finally in the light that it deserves, which is an honest debate between its defenders and its critics, so we can see what are its strengths and its weaknesses and make a rational decision about where we go next, rather than being taken down by a system that can't work very well anymore. Thank you very much. I'd be glad to have a very few minutes of questions and comments, simply because I don't want to push on the hospitality that the new school provided us because of the problems at the Brecht Forum. So,
as far as not talking about capitalism or tough issues, I wanted to make a statement before. Social Security has been off the table for many years. Now it's on the table. Most people here don't know the two major advocates who have been working for the president have been Erskine Bowles, who was a Clinton economic advisor, a Democrat, and Alan Simpson, a very conservative Republican who wants to destroy. But the thing is, they're both on the payroll of Pete Peterson, who is the leader of the whole movement in the country, who is a founder of Blackstone. So they're having this discussion now. They're both agreeing, making it look like both parties are in agreement to stick it to us. Yep.
Very important point. I should have talked about it. You're quite right. Social Security will be here, as it has been in Europe, a key part of the austerity. The basic way is two things. To extend the eligibility. In other words, you don't become eligible for Social Security, and that may also be done with Medicare for years later than now is the case. So, and that's very important for many of you that are young, because what you ought to be doing is reducing the age of Social Security, because that would make it easier for older people to leave the labor force, creating job opportunities for the young people who need them. So if you lowered the age, it would actually help the employment situation. They're going to do the opposite. They're going to make it older. So those of you that are getting near 65, you ought to pay attention, because your eligibility for either Medicare or Social Security may be taken away from you in the next 6 weeks as this is worked out. And the second effect is to lower the benefit program one way or another, by making co-pays and other things in the Medicare part, raising the amount that they charge for Medicare, lowering the payments under Social Security, and so on. And all of those are being considered among the lists of the forms of austerity. And again, pay attention to the European stories. What you see in Europe is what's coming here. They're just a little ahead of us right now because the crisis is worse. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Gracias por todo. You may have spoken about this, but I'd like a little strategy about how, look, where's my Black and Latino and Asian working class in this room? Not here, probably working. And the other thing is, what is the word that you can use? Because I was sitting in a car with writers and also with a co-sex addict, and I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. But in other words, the whole 12-step movement, I think would be in here, because you're talking about denial, but in the economic realm. And so how can we use our language so that people who are afraid of the S word, can hear us? That's what I'd like to hear. Like solution that you would say on the economic, but also on how to deal with racism as a strategy and the tool of the social welfare.
Well, it's a tall order. It's a tall. You're absolutely right. It's the $64,000 question. What exactly do we do? My hope is, and I don't have the right answer. I wish I did. I like your reference to the 12-step programs. My own feeling is that's where we have to go, that the way we're going to build a movement in this society is by taking a real hard look at one of the very few successful bringing together of people in a genuine social movement, and that's all those 12-step programs, not just AA, but all the anonymouses, and there's a dozen or more of them. It's very sobering for a radical to think what it means that in every city of the United States, there are people meeting every night. They get together. They work collectively. They talk pretty honestly to one another. Whoa, that's a model that has a lot to teach us. And I would think a new left as it emerges, whether it's Occupy or some other thing, would have a lot to learn from a politicized version of the 12-step program. And I know there are people working on that are taking that very, very seriously. As to what is going to bring our Black and Latino and other brothers and sisters into this movement, it has to be their shared experience with us in this situation. As it
Why are people dealing with racism? Because if we don't name racism,
absolutely.
it's not going to go anywhere where
We have to deal with all the things that have been done to keep us separate, to not talk to us about capitalism so we can't discuss it, to make us think that if we talk about it, we're violating some part of being an American, to stop the differences, obviously, between white and black and between this and that religion and all the other things that hold us back. But you know, the thing that has drawn Americans together more than anything else in our history has been economic struggle. I mean, we did overcome that to a remarkable degree. 100%, of course not. But we overcame it to a remarkable degree in the 1930s with many of the movements then that brought black people into political organizations on a scale that we hadn't done as a nation before, et cetera, et cetera. My feeling is I don't know what the best way is, and I don't know what's going to work. So my feeling is everybody get out there, try any which way you got. No one has the answer. It's not just me that doesn't have the answer. None of us do. Had we imagined had we had this meeting, and had we had this last year in the summer, and had somebody stood up in this meeting and said, you know what we're going to do? You know how we're going to get a movement going? A whole bunch of us are going to set up tents in public parks in American cities, and we're going to refuse to leave. I think most of us, certainly me, would have thought that was dumb. And I would have been wrong, stone cold wrong, because when people did it, it electrified the country and changed everything. So I think we have to be very open-minded and say, it's not so important what you do. It's important, do something. Get together with other people in whatever way you think could make them, and we'll see. Some of us will do it and it'll peter out, and others of us will do an Occupy, and we'll all sit there in disbelief as it takes off. But we have to have so many people doing it that we're going to find it almost by accident, in a sense.
And one resource is antiracist.alliance.com. They have the 12 steps for undoing racism.
Okay, good. Say it again, the name?
Antiracist.alliance.com.
Okay, good.
Thank you, Rick, for all this ongoing sharing in view of the disaster capitalism and the built-in perils of austerity relating to what we consider our basic monetary economy, the habit with which we've had for centuries and doesn't seem to be working too well. Where, apart from the examples that you use, like Mondragon, and also the Scandinavian countries, which America doesn't seem to want to look at the good things that they do over there, do you feel France with Hollande is a good example of at least transition possibilities to, I don't know, bartering again or whatever is going to be eco-village life or new ways of understanding reality?
I want to be respectful most of the time to the efforts that people are making, whether or not I agree with every detail of it or not, because as I said before, it's important to try something. So the French Socialist Party is trying. It's doing it it's hemming and hawing. It's trying to go a little bit in the direction of raising taxes on rich people, and it's done that. But it's also trying to placate the lenders by taking steps that are austerity-type steps. So it's trying to walk the line. It's not what I would prefer, but I understand they're trying to cope with a situation. And at least they talk a major talk against austerity. They do not want to replicate what is being done in many other European countries. So they open the space for people to do different things from what the norm has become. So I wouldn't underestimate what it meant to have the second most important economy in Europe veer off into a socialist thing. And if you watch the papers and you read between the lines, you will see, particularly in today's paper, yesterday's and today's, that there are growing tensions between Mrs. Merkel in Germany and what she wants and what Mr. Hollande wants. You'll read about that over the next few days. They're not agreeing. And one of the areas they don't agree is how hard to come down on Greece. That's one of the big sticking points. The Germans are tougher. The French want to give the Greeks more time, more space, and so on. So it's a modest move, what the French are doing, but it's a general move away from this austerity, and I think that that's what most people are most frightened about, and so the left has to be respectful that that's where a lot of people are, and that has to be a place where you begin. I'm more excited, because I see it as a thing, to have, as the gentleman who spoke before, to have these concrete efforts to develop new kinds of enterprise. And those are growing all over. This is the year, 2012, the year of the co-op declared by the United Nations. It was not just them trying to help it. There was the recognition that there are movements all over the world to establish this kind of enterprise. I think that's very hopeful. I think there, too, I would be critical only because many of these efforts are very carefully apolitical. The people doing it are afraid of getting into the politics of it. They want it to be done for environmental reasons. They want it to be done for kind of human rights reason. They want it to be done for all kinds, and those are interesting reasons, but they shy away from seeing it as part of a political movement. What I'm trying to do, and if you're, by the way, if you're interested, we've developed a whole new website that I think I've told you about, but if I haven't, it's called democracyatwork.info. If you go there, we've assembled an enormous amount of material there, all available for you on all the different ways around the world that human beings in the United States and beyond are beginning to depart from capitalist enterprises and reestablish them as cooperative, collective enterprises where the people democratically make the decisions and are using that as a way to distance themselves from a capitalist system and to open the space for alternatives. And I think that's a very powerful movement that is where I put my emphasis in terms of my own work. But there are a lot of ways of getting from here to there, and as I said before, I'm most interested in having people try and teach me what will work rather than imagine I have the prescription of the right way to go. It's always been very dangerous on the left when the different parts of it tell each other what the right way to go is. That usually degenerates into something that pleases only the most desperate people and drives away 90% of the people we have to reach. So I don't want to go there. I do not want to. democracyatwork.info. So it's all one word, democracyatwork.info. Okay, we have one more, sir.
Today's New York Wall Street Journal had a headline that the shale oil, which is fracking, is in the United States is going to be equalize the amount of oil that they can get from this country that's going to equal what they can get from Saudi Arabia. Now, I think that's a new problem that can't go away, and that's a very serious problem because we should know what fracking does, and now they're going to push it out there for us to equalize here what they can get from Saudi Arabia. So I think that's
under support. It is, and it'll be a very hard fight to prevent this fracking, and the reason is there is an absolute, I mean, I cannot exaggerate it. There's a kind of euphoria spreading in American business circles because of this image that the fracking, the shale reserves of oil and gas will be so enormous if what looks like is going to be available from the fracking is available, that the United States will replace Saudi Arabia as the largest source and producer of oil and gas for the next 20, 30 years, and that this will be used by the United States in what may be a very serious economic war with Europe, with China, with Japan. Those are all parts of the world that are oil deficit areas. They have to bring oil in. And if the United States is the place from which the oil eventually comes, or a large part of it comes, then the United States may be in a position to force them to pay a good bit more than American companies, and that'll give an advantage to American companies over and against them. That is a none too subtle declaration of economic warfare. How they react to that, what they will do if this kind of situation begins to unfold, is anybody's guess. But in a time of economic difficulty, using these kinds of advantages, if they're there, is often a transition from an economic war to a military war. And it's very, very serious where that can go. And if fracking were to be stopped here, and so that the availability of that oil were to change, or the conditions which make it more expensive and so forth were to change, then that kind of situation might not emerge. We would have the oil, but we wouldn't have it at a competitive price advantage.
Deleterious to the water table.
Yes, absolutely. That's the basis of the fight.
Where are we going? What's going to
We're
happen?
going to stand up. That's what we're going to do.
You're going to become even more used to buying water in a bottle than you already are. And the price of that will go up. It won't be $1. It'll be 10. Thank you all very much for coming. And I hope to see you again early in December.